welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you're listening to this, you're probably the kind of person who wants to know more than just what the law is. You want to know the how and the why behind it.
The mechanics of it.
Exactly. Today, we're dissecting the legal mechanics of contract damages under the Uniform Commercial Code. Specifically, a tension that gets...
Well, it drives law students crazy. It's the conflict between a buyer who backs out and a seller who just resells the goods.
Right. It sounds like a simple scenario, no harm, no foul.
Yeah.
But legally, it is an absolute minefield.
It really is. So let's state the core problem right up front, because I think it feels intuitively wrong to a lot of people. If I agree to buy a boat from a dealer, and then I break that contract, but the dealer just sells that exact same boat to someone else for the exact same price, has the dealer actually lost any money?
Common sense says they are whole. They got their money.
But the law, specifically the Uniform Commercial Code, has a very different take on that economic reality.
It certainly does. And that is the precise question we're grappling with. To answer it, we're going to dive into the primary source. Neri v. Retail Marine Corporation, a landmark decision by the Court of Appeals of New York.
This case is really the definitive battleground for what's known as the lost volume seller doctrine.
A great name for it. So what's our mission today?
Our mission is to navigate the transition from the standard measure of damages under UCC 2708, which works for most things, to the lost profits measure under UCC 27082, which is where things get complicated.
Okay.
We're going to look at four key doctrines: the buyer's right to restitution, the seller's right to offset, the concept of incidental damages, and finally, that legal fiction of the lost volume seller.
All right, let's unpack this. Before we get into the sad story of Mr. Neri and his boat, we need to understand the tools the court is using. Let's set the baseline. So first things first, the measurement of damages. What is the general rule under the UCC for calculating a seller's damages when a buyer just walks away?
The general rule is found in UCC 27081. It's the standard measure. It calculates damages as the difference between the market price at the time and place for tender and the unpaid contract price.
Okay.
And you also add any incidental damages, but crucially, you subtract any expenses saved because of the breach.
That seems straightforward enough. So if I contract to sell you, say, 1,000 bushels of wheat for $100 and the market price crashes to 90 and you back out,
I see where you're going.
I can just sell it on the market for 90. I've lost $10. The law says you owe me that $10.
Precisely. That rule works perfectly for commodities or standard sellers. You know, if you're selling a unique used car, a load of lumber, shares of stock, that market price formula makes you whole. It puts you right back in the position you would have been in.
But the UCC recognizes that this formula doesn't always work. If I'm a car dealership or a boat dealership, the math, it changes. So let's introduce the exception, the lost volume exception. When is that general rule market price minus contract price? When is it deemed insufficient?
It's deemed insufficient when the standard measure is, and this is the key phrase, inadequate to put the seller in as good a position as performance would have done.
So when the math just doesn't reflect the real economic loss.
Exactly. When that happens, the measure shifts to UCC 2708. This is the lost profit measure.
What does that rule actually look like? Because lost profit sounds a little vague.
It's actually quite specific, though applying it is where the headache begins. So Rule 27082 has several distinct elements. First, you have to prove the inadequacy of the standard measure we just talked about.
Okay, step one.
Second, you calculate the profit, which, and this is important, explicitly includes reasonable overhead that the seller would have made. Third, you add incidental damages. Fourth, you make due allowance for costs incurred.
The last one.
And finally, and this is the controversial part we'll spend some time on, you must determine due credit for payments or proceeds of resale.
That last part, the proceeds of resale, that is where the friction really happens, isn't it?
Oh, it's the trapdoor in the statute. But let's ground this in reality. Let's analyze Neri v. Retail Marine Corp to see this rule in action. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
Let's hear them.
All right. So the plaintiffs, Mr. and Mrs. Neri, they contracted to buy a specific model boat from Retail Marine Corporation. The price was $12,587.40.
A lot of money.
It was. And to secure the deal, Neri paid a pretty substantial deposit of $4,250. The dealer didn't have the boat in stock, so they ordered it from the manufacturer for immediate delivery.
Okay, a standard transaction so far. But then life gets in the way.
Right. 6 days later, Neri's lawyer sent a letter rescinding the contract. It turns out Mr. Neri required hospitalization and surgery. It wasn't just a change of heart, it was a serious medical necessity. He just couldn't go through with the purchase.
And the dealer.
Well, the dealer had already received the boat from the manufacturer.
And here's the fact that drives the whole legal battle. The dealer didn't just sit on the boat forever.
Correct. Crucially, 4 months later, the dealer sold that specific boat, the one Neri ordered, to a new buyer for the same price, $12,587.40.
Okay, so the dealer got their money eventually. Neri wants his deposit back. The dealer says, no way. So Neri sues.
Neri sued for restitution to get his $4,250 deposit back. The dealer counterclaimed. They argued that despite the resale, they were entitled to lost profits of $2,579 and incidental damages of $674 for storing the boat.
Wow. Okay, this sets up the conflict perfectly. And what was the core legal issue the Court of Appeals had to solve?
The issue is this. Is a retail dealer entitled to recover lost profits under UCC 27082 when the buyer repudiates, even if the dealer successfully resells the goods to another buyer for the original contract price?
So what rule of law did the court apply? Please state the full black-letter rule and break it down for us into its testable elements.
The court applied UCC 27082, and the rule has 4 distinct testable elements here. First, inadequacy of subsection 1. Does the difference between market price and contract price actually make the seller whole?
Okay.
Second, profit measure. The seller is entitled to the profit, including reasonable overhead they would have made from full performance.
Got it.
Third, incidental damages. The seller is entitled to commercially reasonable charges incurred, like storage or care of the goods. And fourth, proceeds of resale. The determination of whether the resale proceeds should be credited against the damages.
Thank you. Now, let's break this down like a surgeon. We have to go through the court's elemental analysis. Let's start with that first hurdle. How did the court apply the first element, inadequacy of subsection 1?
Right, this is the gateway to the whole lost volume doctrine. The sub-issue here is, does the fact that the boat sold for the same price mean the seller lost nothing?
Which is what the trial court originally thought.
Exactly. The trial court's analysis started with the standard rule. Under subsection 1, you take the market price, $12,587, and subtract the contract price, also $12,587, and you get 0 damages. The trial court said, dealer, you got your price, you're recouped.
But the Court of Appeals disagreed.
They found this standard measure inadequate with mathematical certainty.
Hold on. Mathematical certainty is a strong phrase when the math literally equals 0. Why was the trial court wrong?
It's because of the nature of the seller. Retail Marine is a dealer. They have what the law considers an inexhaustible supply. This is where that infinite parking lot concept comes in. If Neri hadn't breached, the dealer would have sold 2 boats, one to Neri and one to the second buyer.
Ah, I see.
By breaching, Neri didn't just delay a sale, he cost the dealer one specific turnover or profit unit. Therefore, the standard measure of subsection 1 is inadequate because it doesn't account for that lost volume of sales.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not about the specific physical object. It's about the number of transactions. If I scare away a customer, I can't replace them with another customer I would have had anyway. Okay, understood. Now, what about the second element, the profit measure? How do you calculate what that lost transaction is worth?
So moving to the profit element, the sub-rule is that the seller receives the profit they would have made on that specific contract.
And how did that play out?
In the analysis, the dealer had to, open their books. They proved that on a boat costing $12,587, their profit margin after paying the manufacturer and covering overhead was $2,579.
So the conclusion was simple?
Straightforward. The court awarded the full $2,579 as an offset against the deposit. That is the money the dealer would have had in their pocket if Neri hadn't gotten sick.
Okay, so the dealer gets their profit, but they also held onto this boat for 4 months. It's taking up space. How did the court analyze the third element, incidental damages?
This brings us to incidentals. The sub-issue here is whether the dealer can recover costs for just keeping the boat for those 4 months between the breach and the resale.
And the facts on that?
The facts are that the dealer presented proof of $674 in expenses. And this wasn't just some made-up number. It covered storage fees, upkeep to keep the boat looking new, finance charges on the loan the dealer took out to buy the boat, and insurance.
Things you wouldn't have to pay if the sale went through on time.
Precisely. In the analysis, the trial court had denied this. They basically thought, well, you sold it eventually, so these are just costs of doing business. But the Court of Appeal said absolutely not. The evidence was uncontroverted. Neri's breach forced them to hold that inventory longer than planned.
So what was the conclusion?
The conclusion is that the dealer is entitled to the full $674 in incidental damages under UCC 2710.
And finally, we get to the most tricky part, the part that confuses everyone when they read the statute. How did the court handle the fourth element regarding due credit for payments or proceeds of resale?
This is the most counterintuitive part of the case, and honestly, it's a failure of legislative drafting. Let's look at the proceeds of resale element.
Okay.
The sub-issue comes from the text of the statute itself. UCC 27082 says damages are profitless, due credit for payments or proceeds of resale. Now, think about that literally.
Right. If the damages are the profit, say $2,500, and you have to subtract the resale proceeds, $12,000, you end up with a negative number. The dealer would owe the buyer money.
It makes no sense. The rule destroys itself.
So did the court just ignore the law?
Effectively, yes. In their analysis, the court realized that if you subtract the resale price, the lost volume doctrine is impossible. It would never work. The court relied heavily on legislative history and the analysis of a legal scholar, Dean Hockland, to resolve this.
And what was the argument?
Hockland argued that the due credit clause was a drafting error when applied to volume sellers. So the rule application is that the credit for proceeds of resale clause applies only to sellers who are not lost volume sellers, like someone selling their one used car. For a retailer with an unlimited supply, this clause is deemed inapplicable.
So the conclusion is they just ignore it.
They ignore the resale proceeds entirely for the calculation of damages. They did not deduct the second sale price from the lost profit.
That is wild. They looked at the statute, saw it didn't make economic sense, and decided it didn't apply. So after analyzing all these elements, the inadequate standard rule, the profit, the incidentals, and ignoring the resale credit, what was the court's final conclusion?
The holding is a multi-step calculation that balances everyone's rights. First, UCC 27082 applies because 7081 is inadequate.
Right.
Second, the plaintiffs, the Neris, are entitled to restitution. They get their deposit back, which was $4,250.
Okay,
But third, the dealer gets an offset. They get the lost profit of $2,579 and D, the incidental damages of $674.
so the total offset is...
A total offset of $3,253. So Neri recovers only the difference between the deposit and that offset. Neri gets back just $997 out of his $4,250.
He lost over $3,000 for a boat he never even took home. That stings. But based on the logic of the lost turnover, it protects the dealer.
It does.
I want to cement this because that concept of the inapplicable resale credit is so slippery. Let's use a visceral hypothetical. You mentioned the infinite parking lot earlier. Walk us through that again, but slowly. I want the listener to really visualize the asphalt.
Okay. Picture a massive dealership. It's an infinite sea of asphalt. On this lot, there are, say, 1,000 identical red sedans.
Got it.
Buyer A walks in. He points to a car and says, "I'll take that one." Contract signed for $20,000. But then buyer A breaches. He walks away. The car stays on the lot.
Okay.
The very next day, buyer B walks in. He points to that exact same physical car, same VIN, same tires, and buys it for $20,000.
Okay. Visually, the car is gone. The dealer has $20,000. Why isn't the dealer happy?
Look at the empty spaces in the asphalt. That's the key. If buyer A had performed and buyer B had performed, there would be 2 empty spots in that lot. The dealer would have $40,000 and 2 fewer cars.
Wow.
Because buyer A breached, there is only 1 empty spot. The dealer has $20,000 and 1 fewer car. The breach depleted the dealer's sales to the extent of 1. The dealer has physically lost the movement of 1 unit of inventory.
That clarifies it. If you credit the resale money from buyer B against buyer A's debt, you are essentially letting buyer A off the hook using buyer B's money.
Exactly. And since buyer B was going to buy a car anyway, that money shouldn't count toward buyer A's breach. You cannot rob Peter, the second sale, to pay Paul, the first breach.
This is high-level stuff. We've covered the text, the history, the math, the parking lot. For the learner listening who needs to apply this on an exam or in practice, let's synthesize this. I had a diagnostic checklist. How do I spot this issue before I drown in the facts?
Absolutely. When you see a breach of contract problem involving goods, don't just jump to, he broke it, he pays. Use this step-by-step framework. Step 1. Identify the breach. Simple enough. Did the buyer repudiate or fail to accept goods? This triggers the seller's remedies.
Okay, check.
Step 2. Check for deposit. UCC 2718. This is often missed. Does the buyer have a right to restitution? Start with the assumption the buyer gets their money back. Remember, Neri got his money back. It was just subject to the offset.
Right, don't forget the restitution part.
Step 3. Classify the seller. This is the critical fork in the road. Ask yourself, is this a private party like you selling your guitar online, or is it a retailer, a lost volume seller? And the checkpoint is, does the seller have an inexhaustible supply or standard priced goods? If yes, you are in lost volume territory.
That's the main decision point.
It is. So, step 4, apply the formula. If it's a private party, use UCC 2708, that's contract price minus market price. If they resold for the same price, damages are likely 0. If it's a retailer volume seller, skip to UCC 27082. You explicitly state that the first rule is inadequate because of the lost volume.
Don't even bother with the first rule.
Correct. Then step 5, calculate lost volume damages. Take the profit on the specific sale. ADD reasonable overhead. ADD incidental damages storage, insurance, finance charges, remember the 4 months in Neri.
And finally, the trap.
Step 6, the resale trap. This is where you get the A grade. If it is a lost volume seller, do not deduct the proceeds of the resale to the second buyer. You must explicitly state. Although the statute says to credit proceeds, the court holds this clause inapplicable to lost volume sellers to preserve the lost profit remedy.
That checklist is gold. It forces you to look at who the seller is before you even start to do the math.
And that's the lesson of Neri. The law cares about economic status. A dealer is not a neighbor. A store is not a person. The law synthesizes the remedy to match the business model.
Before we wrap up, I have one final provocative thought for you to chew on. We talked about reselling for the same price. But what if the market went crazy? What if the dealer sold the boat to the second buyer for more than the original price? Let's say Neri agreed to $12,000, but the next guy paid $15,000.
Oh, that's a great question.
Would that extra $3,000 profit be deducted from Neri's damages? Or does the lost volume theory protect the dealer's profits in both directions?
That is a fascinating wrinkle. I mean, if you follow the strict lost volume logic, the dealer would argue, I would have sold that boat for $15,000 anyway, plus Neri's boat for $12,000. So they might argue they keep the extra profit and sue Neri.
But would a court buy that?
Courts get a little squeamish about overcompensating sellers. It's a dangerous question to ask unless you want to write a law review article.
We'll leave that for the listener to explore. Next time you walk into a dealership and sign a contract for a car, a boat, or even a large appliance, remember the lost volume filter. Just because they can sell it to someone else doesn't mean you're off the hook. You've completed this deep dive.